have ideas about how you think those things go. But I don't know. What do we think about this? What do we owe other people?
You're trying to give other countries peace within each other and almost overstepping to force that on them instead of let them handle it themselves.
Our outside viewpoint. Nelson's from Canada. Canadians, maybe, and I think internationally, the United States can get viewed as a bully sometimes. The idea that maybe we interject ourselves into other people's problems that aren't necessarily our business. I would say that's a fair kind of representation of how many other countries look at the United States, whether they be developed countries or other countries. And just because that's a prevailing sentiment, I don't know that that makes it correct. But I think we're certainly going to see instances over the second half of the course here where we maybe overstep in places, whatever that may be. Anybody watch that Turning Point documentary on Netflix about 9/11? Came out like a couple weeks ago.
I think I started.
I saw like snippets of it though.
It was all right. But like that was an interesting way to kind of encapsulate this conflict where the United States has been like, the United States went to Afghanistan, maybe it's easier to talk about this in different ways, for like probably the right reasons. Go smash Osama bin Laden after he knocked down the Twin Towers. Now, should we have maybe gone after Saudi Arabia, who 17 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia? Maybe, but they own all of our debt. They'd default on our loans, and then we'd really be up shit's creek, probably. Some of this stuff gets really tricky. Do we have a responsibility to help these other countries?
I guess do it anyway.
Kind of. I would say yes and no, knowing it.
In some aspects.
I would say it's a responsibility. I would say it's like more giving back to them helping us.
Because we get resources from half of them. So
If there's like a reciprocity, we owe them something. Like if we're getting something back, we got to do something for these other countries.
yes.
What are some of the dangers of getting involved in other countries?
Soldiers being killed. From other countries' viewpoint, if you piss America off, they wipe you off the map.
It could happen. We have a very big military, the largest military in the history of the world, with more technologies than you can shake a stick at. That's one. You said soldiers. That's obviously less and less, though. The idea of like, one of the things that kind of stood out to me in that documentary about 9/11 was this idea that like, late in the war, our strategy shifted to minimize casualties because we don't like to see that on the news, and so we just use drones to bomb the shit out of people. Which, good thing. I could use my drone skills somewhere else, Jackson. Probably not. Different kinds of drones. We see dangers in that, like, we can get caught into some of these conflicts other places too, right? The idea that once you kind of get involved, then you are involved. This is maybe what we're going to see in Vietnam, and we're going to see in Afghanistan when we get there. This idea that, like, once you kind of go, you probably have an obligation to do some other things. And that's maybe where these benefits come in. Not only do we have economic benefits, I think those are the easy ones to see. You know, like in the Philippines, we're going to open up a new market, or we became involved with our other North American countries in the mid-90s, like we'll see later in this course, with the North American Free Trade Agreement, for better or worse, which had all sorts of unintended consequences. And we see some of those kind of benefits. This is just something I want you guys to tuck in the back of your mind, because I think it's really important thing, like when you think about your own, I don't know, as citizens, your own political reality, some of these things, this is a pretty central question probably to how you're going to think about all sorts of other stuff. And as we look at some of these different things, I want you to consider how this ties into some of the questions you had for this week. The idea, like Bailey, you looked at nativism, or the idea of like, could you give me a short nativist definition? You had to know what it was to do your paper.
Wasn't it like basically having like immigrants come
There's an element of that. I mean, and the nativist movement in the United States is going to start during this time period. We'll talk about this a little bit on Thursday. Is, I think, still like has made a comeback in the last 10 or 15 years. There's a thing like probably even less time than that. I feel like when I started teaching, nativism wasn't a thing people like talked about. But I think we start to hear more and more over the last 5 to 7 years maybe. The idea that like America first, that's something we're gonna see not only during our current moment, during this moment of nativism, but also we're gonna see this during World War I as well, where this movement gains traction at different points in time, especially the idea as it ties into immigration, which was one of the other questions, especially our group over here kind of looked at this idea that we have, this ties into immigration. If the United States goes to other countries and disrupts their governmental situation, it can create all sorts of problems. The idea that like this pops up in the news constantly, and unless we understand this historical past, it's really difficult for us to understand current moments. Like, has anybody watched the news in the last couple of weeks? Down at the southern border, there's a lot of people from Haiti trying to come into the country. Now, whether you think Haitians should stay in their own country, whether you think they should be allowed into the United States, whether you think borders are a fictive thing that people invented and whatever, whether you are a hardline anti-immigration person, one of the things that would give you better context to that is understanding that the United States has been tied into Haiti's government, sometimes violently, all the way back into the 1800s. A lot of Haiti's fates have been tied up in the United States, especially post-French colonialism and after the Haitian Revolution. And like some of these things color these current moments. And that's where I think like some of this stuff, we gotta start seeing it over time, not only into the past, but into our present and maybe into the future. And so I want you guys to think about some of that stuff. We're not gonna get this all sorted out today because these questions that you guys are working on this week and some of these big things we're talking about the United States globally are things that are gonna constitute a major theme for the rest of the class, because America's history in the 20th century is tied into America as a global superpower. Anybody seen Team America World Police? Oh, that was a shitty movie with puppets that came out in 2006. It's made by the people that made South Park. It hasn't aged well, so if you watch it, just know that we look at things differently in 2021. Anyway, this idea that the United States has risen to global prominence is starting to change and move into an era where we do have military bases throughout the entire globe, where our Navy protects all of the global shipping lanes that allow the economy to work globally. And we see like a lot of kind of different American economic inroads into places on all of the continents of the globe. These are things that we have to see how this starts to develop. So let's talk a little bit about America expanding during this time period. So I got the last 8 minutes. Oh, cool. As we look at this, I think we have to kind of understand where we are starting from and where maybe we're going. So as you guys work on this today, I want you guys to be focused specifically on Hawaii. That's going to be our big task. This other stuff will also color how we talk about this. So we can see this from the text, the idea that the word empire might conjure images of ancient Rome, the Persian Empire, the British Empire, powers that depended variously on military conquest, colonization, occupation, or direct resource exploitation. But empires can take many forms, and imperial processes can occur in many contexts. Some people will argue, yes. Oh, sure. Some people will argue that the United States had become an empire from the moment it was created. The idea that the 13 original colonies, as they come out of the American Revolution and start to spread out west of the Appalachian Mountains, some people would argue that the United States is becoming an empire by conquering different native peoples over time. So maybe we could see that as a continuity, this idea that the United States had been expanding in the time period before this, whether you think it was expanding as an empire or not, but the United States is moving across the continent. And one of the things that led us to the American Revolution, which isn't the focus of this class, but is important for us to understand, is that in 1763, the British Crown, following what we commonly call the French and Indian War, said that American settlers can move west beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And this led a lot of colonists to change their feelings about the British Crown because they were interested. And these are like important people. People like George Washington, who had spent the previous few years in the British military out in the Ohio River Valley, looking at some of these lands, hoping to buy some of this land as he went out. I want you to think about 100 years after this time period, as the United States has expanded across the entire continent of North America, we're seeing it maybe becoming an empire of its own. People during the time period never talked about the United States as an empire as it stretched from the East Coast to the West Coast. So we don't normally talk about it that way today. This idea that we could maybe see some of this at different points in time. Whether you look at it with indigenous peoples or you look at it with the war against Mexico during the 1840s, where we're going to essentially offer to buy the southwestern United States from Mexico, they're going to say, no thanks. This is an oversimplification. We're going to say, cool, we'll fight you. We're going to lay siege to the capital city of Mexico City. They go, here, take less money, and we're going to take California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, part of Wyoming, Oklahoma, Texas. Some people would look at that as maybe being empire building, colonizing, moving across the continent. But again, this isn't a way we've normally talked about this. During this time period, this becomes a really kind of important question that people throughout the United States are debating. That was Nico's question, right? Nico, you looked at how American feelings towards foreign policy changed during the late 19th century. Tough question. Big macro question. Don't worry, I'm not going to put you on the spot with it. But this question of American empire and American imperialism really rose to the front of conversations regular Americans were having during this late 1800s time period. America was starting to look beyond our own borders. We were starting to go through the end of the Industrial Revolution. We needed new markets for different goods. And there are all sorts of different arguments that people started to make for the United States to continue to expand. So this question of American imperialism seeks to understand not only some of these direct American interventions in places like Cuba, the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, but also kind of this deeper American engagement with the wider world. And that's why I wanted you guys to think about this when we got started today, because I think like you have to have this seed in the back of your mind and start asking yourself this question. Because I think you can't understand any of your own political positions until you start to understand how you view America in the world and what some of our obligations, responsibilities are to other people. And people were thinking about this during this time period. American economic, political, and cultural power has shaped our actions, choices, and possibilities, and it's shaped the opportunities for other peoples as well. As this has happened, some of these other questions get tied up into it. And this is where Bailey's question about nativism comes in. Who is an American? Who isn't an American? This idea of what were the nation's obligation to foreign powers and foreign peoples, how accessible and how fluid should American identity be for newcomers? Can you truly become American if you come from somewhere else? This is an important cultural question that people are considering not only during that time period, but I would argue that people still talk and think about today. There are groups of people in the country that believe that if you aren't born here, you could never become an American. And I think there's other people that view a more opportunistic version of America that looks at, maybe it's built around the argument that most people, unless you're an indigenous person, your family came here from somewhere else at some point in time. Sometimes we talk about America as a country of immigrants, and so these questions are important as we kind of go through this next part of the class. All such questions confronted late 19th century Americans with a new urgency, especially as America started to get involved overseas. And so we have this traditional lower 48 kind of vision of America, and all of these other places are going to, at one time or another, kind of raise some of these questions. We think of Alaska and Hawaii as being part of America today because we're just kind of used to that. 50 states is a nice round number. But when we look at some of these other places, be they the Philippines or places like Puerto Rico or even America's Samoa, some of these other places, America has a very strong presence in some of the territories we still hold today. We want to think about these questions again. This idea, who is an American and who wasn't, and what are our obligations to foreign powers and foreign peoples? These are really important questions for us to be thinking about, and that's why we're going to spend the week doing it. So our first question that's going to kind of lead us through this and into our example of why is going to be this question about how did American policy change during the late 19th century? Up to this point, America had been pretty much inwardly focused, or at least focused on the continent. So like our continuity would be America is continuing to expand over its first 100 years, post-revolution from 1776 to 1876. But part of that is just America's developing, whether that be solving some of our own issues as they relate to economic systems and things like American slavery, whether they be the expansion and settlement of the United States and dealing with indigenous peoples. These are things that took up a lot of focus for American leaders and American people over the first 100 years of the United States existing. As we started to move into the late 1800s and Native peoples were largely on reservations, we had moved out of the slavery era in the American South, and we're moving into a new America that's rapidly industrializing. People start to look at the country differently and its role globally, and America is ascended in the late 1800s. This idea that the United States has been fairly weak militarily up to this point. The United States has been economically kind of a second-tier country globally. One of the things that we have to consider is that sometime between now and the end of World War II, we're going to see the United States become the most powerful military country, the most powerful economic country, and perhaps the most powerful cultural country on the planet over the span of 50 years. So something's going to have to change. Part of these changes are technological. The United States is applying new processes, and we're rapidly becoming a greater economic power during this time period. We've been talking about the Industrial Revolution in this class, and so one of the changes is going to be the United States has completed industrialization. We've moved to a point where we have new processes, like you guys talked about Taylorism, some of you in your assignments a few weeks ago when we were looking at industrialization. We're seeing increased efficiency. We're seeing the United States use all of these different natural resources that we're pulling from throughout the country and using them to build up our economy. One of the things that happens during the late 19th century is we need new markets for some of these manufactured goods. We do make stuff in America today. Shout out to My Pillow guy, right? He's always on TV talking about it. Emily shakes her head like
so annoying.
He is kind of annoying. But the idea that there are things, or maybe Winnebago is a better example, they're making something here in the United States, or Vermeer Manufacturing in my town. Anybody got a big company in their town that they're from that makes something that everybody would know?
General Mills?
General Mills makes cereal for people to eat. Food products are important. You guys got Target in the Twin Cities too. That's a big corporate headquarters there. Best Buy's there. Now Winnebago also.
HEB.
What's that?
HEB.
HP? Hewlett?
No, HEB.
HEB? I don't even know what that is.
It's a Texas grocery store. I used to work for them.
All right. It's like Hy-Vee in Iowa, but Texas version. It's way cooler.
Yeah, it's
like because that's where you're from.
Yeah,
I'm an Aldi person anyway. No, I go to
You
Hy-Vee.
can get really good food for cheap.
We try to grow our food. I think we've been over this. We're going to talk about agriculture in a while. But everybody ends up at Aldi or Hy-Vee sooner or later. Grocery stores are kind of a thing. Anybody else? Like small towns throughout the country, one of the things that's going to happen that we'll see in the 20th century is going to be most start some kind of manufacturing interest, but that's a little bit different. But one of the things that's happening during this time period is America's expanded. We've seen more people having more money in their pockets, and these are things we've already talked about in this class. But one of the things that's happening is, as we ramp up these industrial processes, some of our things like Ford Motor Company, or even if you're making things like electric fans, you're making household appliances, you're making tractors, whatever that might be, the market's becoming saturated by the late 1800s, and there's a need for new markets for some of these goods. The idea that like if you are a family during this time period and you're going to buy a car, you're probably going to have one car. You're going to buy a Ford Model T, and like that's going to be your family's car, and you're going to use it to get around. And as more and more families are able to buy cars, there's a need for markets elsewhere. And one of the things that American business people start to look at is if we can expand into other places, notably the Pacific, or into Latin America, it's going to give us opportunities to make more money and continue to manufacture things at the rates that we're doing. We also see during this time period the American military is starting to modernize. Literally in like 1875, the American Navy looks like not a whole lot different than it did in the 1700s. We're still looking at like masted sailing ships that are made out of wood during the 1770s. And one of the things, we're going to see that technology for the first 100 years kind of be the basis of American military power. In the late 19th century, this guy named Henry Seward is going to write a book that influences a lot of American leaders. And his book's going to be called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And basically, not Henry Seward, Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan is going to make this argument that basically if you have the most powerful navy in the world, you're the most powerful country in the world. And people like Theodore Roosevelt, who's going to be president of the United States eventually, is going to hear this argument, and he's going to go, we should probably build a better navy. And we're going to start to build new and more powerful ships that are going to provide us with some of these other opportunities. We'll see how this kind of goes. So where is this going to actually, where can we see this happening in the historical record? One of the first places we can see this is with batshit, literally. Anybody read about this? Nico, you wrote about it. I thought you phrased it nicely when you were talking about bird excrement. Two things are going to tie in here. We're going to look at two books quick as we kind of go through this. We see this poster for Pacific guano, but American interventions in Mexico, China, and the Middle East reflect the United States' new eagerness to kind of intervene in foreign governments to protect American economic interests abroad. In Mexico, some of this is going to be tied into providing some of these other markets. In the Middle East, in particular, we're going to see this tied into oil, especially after the introduction of the internal combustion engine. And the idea that we're seeing a change here that's both political and economic kind of factors coming together. The idea that when the government interferes in some of these business kind of things globally to protect American business interests, we can see both political and economic factors. The United States is not only ready to intervene in foreign affairs to preserve foreign markets, it's kind of willing to take territory. And this we could look at as a continuity or a change. The idea that the United States has been expansionist since it started in 1776 as it spread across the continent. Some people would make that argument, that this is a continuity. The United States has continued to add land, has been growing and increasing itself since it started. You could look at it as a change if you kind of look at it through this manifest destiny lens. The idea that the Americans always talked about spreading across the continent from our earliest days, and then once that had been accomplished, you could view it as change. If you were saying expanding outside of the continent, that's a little bit of a difference from what we're seeing before. Our first Pacific territories are going to come with the Guano Islands Act of 1856. Guano collected bird excrement was a popular fertilizer integral to industrial farming. That's the exact quote you had in your paper, right, Nico?
Yeah.
I know. Why did people need fertilizer? We're destroying the soil in America. This is a really smart guy, Stephen Stoll, who once shit on me at a conference, but it wasn't related to bird shit. He gave me some really good feedback. You go to conferences, give your papers, hope people will just take swings at you, and then you'll get drunk and beat them up in the elevator later. Just kidding. But he's going to talk about one of the things that drove us into the Pacific here, or at least what the need was. And this is his book, Larding the Lean Earth, and it's called Soil and Society in 19th Century America. So he's talking about in the 1850s what maybe drove people to look for new lands, what allowed people to look for some of these goods. And he says, this is a story all about greed and waste. Europeans arrived in tens of thousands of years after the ancestors of the American Indians and went about dividing land, cutting trees, damming rivers, shooting buffalo, ripping up mountains for minerals, killing off whales, and skimming fertility over and over again in every new place. Sometimes I think Steven Stoll likes to get too hype on like making Americans look bad, but that's kind of his vibe. The free-for-all continued until a few people warned that game animals and timber supplies would not recover without human intervention. The United States put these fears into public policy by nationalizing millions of acres, mostly in the West, in order to regulate the private use of resources, and that became conservation. Yeah, this is the only one thread of Richter's story. It has nothing to say about Michael Keelty's grandparents, which is an allusion to something he was talking about before. Animal manure anchored a nutrient cycle with the potential to create a steady state between taking away and putting back. Not only that, when farmers in the past husbanded soils in addition to plants and animals, they installed a system that never needed to be fed with fresh land. In short, these practices conserve not only fertility at the farmstead, but also a greater landscape of forest and lowlands. By allowing families to stay rather than migrate overland, they offered stability to rural communities. Historians have recently began to tell this complicated story of conservation with attention, for example, to the resistance people living in places where the government imposed boundaries and regulations and so on and so forth. But his point is that during this century, during the 1800s, the idea that Americans had started to kind of change how our agricultural system worked called for more inputs into soil. Emily, do we use soil, all sorts of inputs to make our soil fertile in Iowa today? Nitrogen, right? That's why you don't want to drink the river water, or like some of the readings, I don't know. Some of that has to do with CFAOs. So one of the things that Stoll's talking about is like up the 1700s at least. A white boy's coming on Thursday. Get excited, guys. I'm not going to put the thing up anymore. This idea that like farmers before this point in time, they would, let's say we have a farm. Okay, so we have a farm. This is your farm. You're gonna have your little house over here. Maybe you're gonna have a big barn. Maybe, I don't know, the rest of this we're gonna turn into fields, right? And what kind of things can you do to promote soil fertility, would you suppose? Crop rotation, the easy answer, right? We're gonna go like corn, beans, beans. Those of you that don't know much about agriculture, corn and beans do different things, especially when it comes to nutrient fixing in the soil, especially as it relates to nitrogen. And if we planted this arrangement one year, maybe the next year this is gonna become a B, and this is gonna become a C, and this is gonna become a B. And we're rotating crops, and that'll do some things to help your soil fertility and give you better longevity as a farm. Anybody into like plants? Anybody got like a good succulent collection going? No, just me. My wife is a houseplant nut.
And your office is like filled from.
Well, that's because like it, like for this, so whatever, this is an aside. You need good conditions to grow things, right?
Sure.
And my office is the ideal place to grow cacti and other succulents. Like they will just explode in size if you give them enough water and they have good soil quality. I don't know what it is, but it's great in there. And also our house has no opportunities for that. We live in Forest Park in Mason City. We have 1,000 trees in our yard. Our house is kind of dark. My wife has 75 houseplants at home, but none of them are those types, except for like some that have already come to my office and gotten way too big. Like we have an aloe at our house that's like, it's just too big. And it has all these babies every year, and then it's like we have 40 of these, whatever. Plants to grow, water, light, soil nutrients. We get it. One of the other things farmers are doing, especially during this early time period, is most of them have livestock. So maybe you have this barn, we're gonna have a barnyard, and that's gonna have other animals living there. You've probably seen Charlotte's Web, you know, you might have pigs, cows, sheep. I don't know what else you're gonna have, but you have some. Maybe they're grazers, but all of them take dumps. What people would do in the 1700s is collect the poo. They would put it in a big heap. They called it a dung heap. Then, after the agricultural season was over, they would go spread it out on their fields, which would provide all sorts of nutrients into it. One of the things that happens in agriculture during the 1800s is people start to specialize. So you might not have animals on your farm anymore, which cuts out this manure part of the cycle. tough shit. The idea that as this happens, people are specializing and growing more things. Yeah, that was a poop pun. There's a lot of stuff here. But we're seeing more and more soil get bankrupted in the United States. That's what Stoll's whole book is. That's his whole argument, is that like people are really, especially in the late 1800s, having to face the reality that our farming methods have like left behind the idea of soil fertility and health, and using some of these inputs is going to have to replace some of these other practices that have allowed people to start to do this. One of the things that people had done prior to this is they had just moved further west onto fertile land in other places. One of the things, like for instance, the Talo plantation in Virginia is in the neck of Virginia, kind of on the east coast. They had become very wealthy and had done lots of, grown their operation to include more than farming, largely on the back of enslaved peoples. And when their farm could no longer grow anything because they had completely exhausted the soil, they bought a bunch of land in Alabama and Mississippi and then forced marched tons of enslaved people from their plantation somewhere else. We also saw farmers leaving the East Coast if their soil got bankrupted and moving to places like Iowa in order to access fertile soil. Does that make sense? Manifest destiny, though, the United States has expanded all the way out. There's no longer an opportunity to just go find new land to farm, so we need inputs for soils. And we're well before we get into the ag chemical companies starting to sell you nutrients and especially nitrogen. And so one of the initial solutions to this was we're going to go and annex these guano islands in the Pacific. And so here we can maybe see a kind of non-traditional way to think about this. The idea that like even in industries like agriculture, we're needing something from outside the United States in order to improve an American industry. And so this has become a really popular thing to talk about because Gregory Cushman wrote this book, this global ecological history called Guano and the Opening of the Pacific World. And he's talking specifically about this. The idea that, he writes, for the small but vocal class of agricultural improvers in the antebellum United States, manures of this virtue, and he's talking about guano, presented a possible remedy to soil exhaustion, rural immigration, and the erosion of political power from the eastern seaboard to the western frontier. Many hoped the careful stewardship of land would reduce the temptation to move, and in the process create a better, more lasting world. From his tireless genealogical research, Henry realized how many of his farming kin had uprooted themselves from the lands of their birth to, quote, seek bread for his family in a wilderness, unquote. For many in this colonizing society, the temptation to move on and enjoy the ecological bounty of new lands was great. To take but one example, and he's going to go into all of these different examples, but he ultimately comes to the point of this was the era of unbridled territorial expansionism in the United States. U.S. historians tend to obscure the fact that Latin American events played a fundamental role in almost every major conquest by the United States from 1800 to 1850, from Louisiana Territory in 1803 and France's defeat by Haitian revolutionaries, the occupation of Florida during the 1810s, during the Spanish-American Independence Wars, the seizure of half of Mexico during the War of 1846 through 48. Some forms of territorial expansion served the interests of improving farmers, and during the 1850s, American entrepreneurs began combing the Earth's ocean for guano islands so they could bypass this Peruvian monopoly. So one of the things that American farmers are starting to do is they need access to these soil inputs for American farms to continue to be successful. The people that are offering this market on a global scale are going to be in the country of Peru. And they're going to be demanding high prices. They have a monopoly on the whole market. And Americans go, well, if we found some of these other places that maybe have this product, this guano, we're going to be able to kind of add them into our territories, and then we'll have a kind of corner on this market that we can start to do. So this is going to be one of the things, and maybe just one example of how we can see the United States starting to look beyond its borders for different things. So the Act's going to authorize and encourage Americans to venture into the seas and claim islands with guano deposits for the United States. It's little known, but it is going to become a precedent for future American acquisitions. And this word's really important. What's a precedent? You can even get the context clues. Our entire governmental and legal system is built on precedent in the United States. Like if you want to become a lawyer, all lawyers do is look for precedents. Things that have happened before, examples we could use, previous rulings, things that are going to show us how society and how government has functioned over time. So one of the things that precedents are really important in any legal proceedings, especially in the United States with how our governmental system's constructed. And one of the reasons that is when we created our government and our social contract, we looked backwards for precedents in the English Constitution. Built our system off things that were already there. And so, although this is kind of a minor thing, we've been wandering around talking about bird shit for 15 minutes, Nelson. Never thought you'd get there. It creates this precedent where the United States can start to expand overseas for economic interests. And that's an important change we want to be considering. So one of the ways we can maybe see this more clearly is if we look at Hawaii specifically. So with this, Christian missionaries soon are going to follow explorers and traders into Hawaii. First American missionaries arrive in Hawaii in 1820 and China in 1830. And we're going to see these missionaries often working alongside business interests. And in Hawaii, this is going to be the most clear example of this maybe that we can see. Many missionaries, as they arrive in Hawaii, are going to buy land and form plantations that are going to be worked by other immigrants from other Pacific countries during this time period. We're going to see some specific examples, but they're going to start sugar plantations in particular. And during the 19th century, Hawaii is going to be ruled by an oligarchy, this small group of people that's based on sugar companies known as the Big Five, and this kind of white American elite was going to be extremely powerful, but still operate outside the formal expression of American state power. This is just setting the stage for us. So now let's go backwards a little bit and look at how kind of these European and American interests develop in Hawaii. So Hawaii itself is going to be settled, and this is sketchy, but the evidence is tough to actually understand. The idea between 124 and 1120 AD, people are going to arrive in Hawaii on small catamaran fishing boats, probably from the Polynesian islands. As they arrive there, they're going to start to live there over a long period of time. For almost 500 years at least, Hawaiians are going to be largely culturally distinct. They're completely separated from other peoples on the planet. Anybody ever been to Hawaii? Nobody? Has ever? Okay. It's a long ways away. It's kind of a remote place. I think you can see why nobody went there for 500 years. Be hard to find. It's kind of out in the middle of the ocean. Whatever. But one of the things that's going to happen is they're going to develop their own government. They're going to develop their own economy, which they talked about a little bit in the video, this idea that like largely Hawaiian society and their culture is going to be based on this idea of pretty much communal living where people are going to share with each other. That's a gross overstatement, but as we look at this, they're free of this outside influence until James Cook arrives in 1778. So we have a cultural, political, economic continuity with the Hawaiian people living this isolation, using the islands to base their entire life around, where Cook's going to arrive, and that's our change in 1778. So after Cook's arrival, we're going to see the islands united for the first time. Up to this point, we had different tribal societies on the different islands that were all kind of operating independently. They might have traded with each other. They had some cultural exchange. But this is going to be the first time European technologies, predominantly guns, are going to be used to conquer and unify the islands to establish the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1795. So it's going to take about 20 years after Cook's expedition arrives, but by 1795 we're seeing the Kingdom of Hawaii. And it's going to benefit from European interests in the islands agriculturally as well as strategically. We're going to see that play out again and again over time. It's not a mistake that the United States takes Ford Island and turns it into the Pearl Harbor military base that's still there today. And it's also not a mistake that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in World War II because of its strategic importance to the defense of the Western United States. we're a little ahead of ourselves. But by the late 18th century, so 18th century, 1700s, we're going to see Protestant missionaries arriving and starting to set up sugar plantations. So we have two things happening there. The plantations themselves are economic, right? This is going to give these Presbyterian missionaries an economic opportunity to further their work. Everybody's got to work at some point or another. You got to make money, right? The cultural benefit or the cultural reality of this is that they're coming with a cultural mission, right? The idea that these Protestant missionaries are arriving, and their goal is to bring Christianity, particularly Protestant Christianity, to the people of Hawaii, which is a cultural dynamic. The need for labor is going to draw permanent immigrants from a variety of other places. Most of the time, though, we're going to see people coming from Japan, China, and the Philippines, and they're going to come to work on these sugar plantations in Hawaii. They're going to work alongside native Hawaiian islanders, but most of the people that are going to own these plantations are going to be people of American or European extraction. At the same time, the native population is going to be greatly reduced. Smallpox is going to rip through the islands and just destroy this population. We can see it declining from the 1770s. 300,000 people are living in the Hawaiian Islands that are of native Hawaiian descent. By the 1850s, so just in 80 years, we're going to see that down to only 60,000 people. So as this population declines, we're seeing the population of the islands rise with people immigrating in, whether it's from the United States, whether it's from Europe, whether it's from these Asian countries as people are coming to work these lands. And so as this happens, we're going to see some shifting dynamics happen. So as American economic interests grow in Hawaii, plantation owners are going to start to demand a greater political voice. They want some say over how the political system on Hawaii is run. The U.S. Is also going to take a more active interest in Hawaii as a defensive position in the Pacific Ocean. One of the things the United States seeks during the 1800s is to get a location for a naval base, which will ultimately become Pearl Harbor. By 1875, we're going to see both economic and political relationship change between the United States and Hawaii with this reciprocity treaty. What a reciprocity treaty means is that we're going to agree to not put a huge tax on the goods that are coming into the United States from Hawaii in exchange for, in this case, a military base that we're going to put on Ford Island at Pearl Harbor. And one of the things that we can see is, as this happens, it creates a market in the United States for Hawaiian sugar, because Hawaiian sugar is going to become much cheaper compared to alternative options. And so as this happens, it's going to greatly increase the number of acres in agricultural production in Hawaii. And we can see that going from 12,000 acres in 1875 to 125,000 acres by 1891. This radically remakes the landscape of Hawaii, as well as its economic and political power profile during this time period. So we can see some different things happening here that are going to create a more complicated dynamic. One of the things is we have these big five plantation owners. These are all going to be people of European or American kind of descent that are going to seek a much greater political voice during this time period on the Hawaiian Islands. And in order to do that, they're going to try to actually take political power as the Hawaiian Patriotic League. So this is an agent group we can see, and we see these people pictured here, predominantly kind of white group, but this group's going to come together and they're going to create a rebellion in 1887, which is going to lead to the Bayonet Constitution, as it's called. And this document and this kind of revolution is geared towards shifting power, political power in particular, from Hawaiians to people that own property, which are predominantly either Americans or Europeans. Because what's going to happen after the Bayonet Constitution is they're going to operate as a limited democracy, and who can vote in this society are going to be only people that own property. Most Hawaiians by this point in time don't own property in the islands. They're working on these sugar plantations. Most of the people that own property in the Hawaiian Islands by the 1880s, when this constitution is put together, are going to be people that are either Americans or Europeans. We are still going to see Hawaii's going to have a monarch. Grover Cleveland's going to instruct his staff to protect American interests from another revolution happening, and this is going to increase the American military presence on the islands again. We're not quite to annexation yet, but we're getting a lot closer. In the video, we saw our other important agent here, Lily Kalina. I knew I was going to trip on it. Lily Kalani. All right. Anyway, she's going to assume the Hawaiian throne, and she's going to actually try to reinvest power in Hawaiians. She wants a new constitution that gives everybody equal voice, whether you own property or not. And so she wants to lessen property requirements for voting in order specifically to limit the power of non-European citizens as well as Americans. And they're going to be successful. They're going to draft a new constitution. We have a major political change. And it's going to last for 3 days after they have this new constitution before the government's going to be overthrown by a group seeking Hawaii's annexation of the United States. And that's going to happen on January 14th, 1893. And this group that's going to overthrow her government are going to be largely driven by American planters. It's going to be coordinated with the United States State Department. And the goal is going to be one of the things that America becomes very interested or worried about, including President McKinley, who's just been elected in the early 1890s, is that if they kind of take this constitutional step and decrease the power and influence of American interests in Hawaii, it's going to eventually lead to them doing something different with these sugar plantations and become vital to this American market. And John L. Stevens is going to be the American governmental minister who's going to support this overthrow of the government of Hawaii. And ultimately, after this happens, the next government we're going to see in Hawaii is the annexation of Hawaii after it moves into territorial status first and eventually becomes an American state after it's annexed in 1898. I mean, it's going to take until like the 1950s for Hawaii to actually become a state. So we can maybe see in this example the idea that American economic interests abroad are leading America to make some different decisions that lead them to adding more territory. And so we can see maybe this idea that many Americans are going to look for empire across the Pacific or in places like Hawaii. Others are going to look to Latin America. The United States is going to have this kind of long and increasingly complex network of economic, social, and cultural interactions in Latin America in particular, as well as in the Pacific. And as we enter kind of this late 19th century, there's going to be kind of this aggressive interventionist attitude, especially towards countries in South America. And that's where we're going to see the United States enter Cuba during the Spanish-American War, and that's where we're going to pick things up on Thursday, so we can talk about them and the kind of Philippines in conjunction. But we're a little scattered today. Some of the stuff gets really kind of complex as we're talking about economic, social, and cultural, political things all merging together. But it'll probably be a little bit easier to understand as we get through class on Thursday. Until then, hold on to these sheets. I'll take them then. I should have your HTAs in later this afternoon, and I will see you back here Thursday. Yeah, for sure.
But I remember which ones I did because I didn't save.
Yeah, 20 minutes.
You just got them in Word or something?
I do. And then whenever like I'm done, I download it and then I send it. And I see it like on the when I submitted it, and it like has like.
So take the ones you got saved in Word, right? And just attach them to an email and try to send them to me.
Okay.
Figure it out.
Yeah, I'll redo the 2 and 3.
The paper for. Oh, yeah, that's fine. Not till Thursday.
I'm not gonna be here Thursday.
Okay, you can just keep it. Okay. You'll be excused, so. Good luck, that's a long haul you guys got coming.
Yeah, should be a fun one though. Hopefully we'll beat them, get our name on the rankings.
Yeah, and then get back home for a couple weeks, it looks like.